Okay, good morning everyone, good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are. This is Joseph Trevisani from Worldwide Markets, and today's topic is Japan, or what the Japanese are attempting to do with their currency, and with their economy. Okay, so let me just see where we are here, and then we will commence. Close that one. Where is this one? Come on, computer. Okay. The Japanese, it's kind of a great topic here. The Japanese government, the Japanese people, have elected a government, Shinzo, I think that's how, that sounds a bit like Italian, that's probably my pronunciation, Shinzo Abe. He's a long-term Japanese politician. He's 57 or 58. He has long been viewed as a nationalist and as a promoter of Japanese values, if you will, even Japanese cultural values. And he ran on a platform, which is a bit unusual. At least it would be viewed here. He ran on a central bank platform, meaning he promised to devalue the yen and to spark the Japanese economy into sustained growth. And he's planning on doing this in two areas, or at least his program encompasses two basic areas. The first, of course, is the one we'll deal with. We'll deal with both of them today. Let me just put up a note for the Japanese economy so you'll see where GDP is. Did I not do that one? Okay, well, look at the Nikkei. The Nikkei is a good proxy for what's going on in the Japanese economy. This is the problem of Japan. We have the peak back here in the 80s. This was absolutely a bubble. That's when Japan, according to all the journalists, was going to take over the world. That's when the Japanese bought Rockefeller Center, which they later sold at a rather large loss. That's when the Japanese model of just-in-time manufacturing became the model that all industrial countries emulated around the world. This was the period of Japan's greatest confidence. Japanese real estate bubble burst. At one point, supposedly, the area of the Imperial Palace, which I think is 100 acres, I'm not really sure, in Tokyo. Hopefully I'm going to go to Tokyo sometime this year. I've never been there. I would love to go. Hopefully we'll be going back to Asia with Worldwide Markets, and I'm going to go visit a friend of mine in Tokyo. I think it would be fascinating for many reasons, but the most fascinating reason, I think, is what we're going to talk about here today. So I'll talk about that in a minute. This is Japan's moment of greatest confidence. And since then, since about 1990, Japan has been in permanent doldrums. You can compare this to, and I'm not going to do it here, but I'm sure you all know what it looks like, the chart of the U.S. Equities. Very, very different. Yes, the U.S. has bubbles. Come on, computer. But recovery. Growth, confidence, if you will, in the U.S. economy. Sorry, I hear this mouse is not as efficient as I would like it to be. So look at this, okay? So, Japan's efforts of the government are going to will be in two areas, and we're going to talk about them separately, although, of course, they intertwine. One is the bank monetary policy, which primarily in this case relates to the yen. At least that's the way it's been spoken about. Just as an aside, there is no doubt that the yen at 75, at 76, at 78, at 80 makes it difficult for the Japanese exporters. There's no doubt that that's true. It has long been a puzzle. I have addressed this many times, and this is the first topic I'm going to deal with, actually, is what is the yen doing at 80 when the Japanese economy has performed so poorly? No, I do not have a chart up for the Chinese economy. One of the tendencies of my webinars is to go many places and not focus. So today I'm making a serious effort to stay focused on the topic that we're discussing today. It's two aspects, because I find it very fascinating, both from a currency point of view, from a fiscal and economic point of view, from the point of view that Japan is trying to do what the rest of the West is now trying as well, and what this may mean for the future. So there's a lot here. There's enough here so that I'm just going to try and stick to it. So we have two basic areas of manipulation, if you will, or effort by the Japanese government. The BOJ is going to, they've said, or they've agreed, rather grudgingly, and we can't pretend there are any risks here, to weaken the Japanese currency to 100. They keep talking a number of times in the past weeks. They've spoken about 100. That's clearly their goal. That's one side. Can they print enough money? Will the market believe them? Will the currency market go there under the whip of the BOJ? The second is the economy. Will, and this is what they're trying to do, will prolonged, incessant, over the top, if you will, deficit spending, fiscal stimulus, combined with low interest rates, be enough to push the Japanese economy into sustained, reasonable growth? Those are the two questions. So let's deal with the first one, the BOJ. The most valuable commodity possessed by any central bank is not control over the interest rates. It's not the ability to print money. It's not even, as in the case of the United States, the world reserve currency. The most valuable thing that a central bank possesses is credibility. Will it be able to do what it says? Will it follow through? And will it be successful? If you would like an example, the best I can think of, and it's very fresh, of the value of credibility, we have Mario Draghi and the ECB. The ECB did not have to do anything to drive down Spanish and Italian rates. They only had to promise. The market did the rest. This is the best situation that a central bank can possibly be in. The ECB did not have to expand their balance sheets. They didn't have to force Spain to ask for a bailout. They didn't have to do anything. Spanish rates went from 7% down to, I think they're just below 5% now. Is this going to resurrect the Spanish economy? Of course not. But did it prevent Spain being unable to reasonably fund its deficit and perhaps be forced, because of that and because of the costs involved, to ask for a bailout? And the answer is yes. And again, I can't stress enough, the ECB did not have to do anything. Now, part of the reason that's successful is because the ECB had never done that before. The threat is much more valuable if the market, it's like a horror movie. A good horror movie puts very little of the gore on the screen, and it's all off-screen, anticipatory. It lets your imagination do the work for the filmmaker. That is by far the most effective type. It's more like Alfred Hitchcock than Texas Chainsaw Massacre 98 or however many versions of it they have out now. It's the psychology of it which is so effective. That's what's true, without question, in this case as well. The road for the ECB to actually enacting and buying would have been much more difficult than what they did. Because after all, they said they wouldn't do anything until Spain asked for a bailout. So that meant, in order for this to actually act, for the ECB to go out and do in the markets, to force the markets, Spain would have had to have been in much worse shape. And it was a risk, certainly on Mario Draghi's part. Because if the market didn't believe, if they were forced to act, it would only be at the end of another 6 months of absolute and increasing credit market turmoil. But the market and the people involved believed. Now, this is not a religious experience. But they did believe because at the end they thought the ECB would act. Not only that, if you are positioning in these markets, if you are a hedge fund or somebody else involved in these markets, are you going to wait to see if the ECB actually has to act? Or now that they're staking their ground, and the ECB has good credibility, my point, you're going to take your profits. The bonds are high, you're going to sell them, you're going to get out. And that's what happened. Now, we've had several bond sales in Europe. The Irish, the Portuguese, I think. I don't mean to say that derogatorily or dismissively. The Italians and the Spanish. And they all had very good sales. Why? Well, the ECB's backing up the bonds. You can get, 1.5% or whatever it is on a German 10-year, or you can get 3.5% or 4% or 4.5% on a Spanish 10-year. What would you do? That's what happened. So the greatest possession that a central bank have is this credibility. And that is the biggest problem with Japan. Central banks are effective when they are, much like, I'm not going to go there, when they don't have to act and they get the markets either to act for them in a concerted fashion. In other words, the central bank comes in at an inflection point. This has happened many times in foreign exchange, especially in the 90s, less so now. The market is overextended. They push it and it runs. This does work. What the Japanese did in the 90s and after that, they used to come in. And the other thing that a central bank needs is cooperation of other central banks. It doesn't do any good if the central bank is only in one market. Because what will the traders do? As soon as the pressure is off, they'll take profits. I mean, I traded the Japanese, the Tokyo market for Credit Suisse in the 90s. When the Japanese were doing exactly the same thing. They were trying to. And what did we do? I know I've mentioned this in other webinars. What did we on the trading desk do? We waited till the run was over, till the Japanese had stopped intervening, and then we went the other way. We did the same thing every night. And what happened? As soon as the pressure was off, the market stalled, and if there was no additional pressure, the market went back the other way. So you were basically trading, the market was trading against the BOJ every night, and in the end, the market won. Because the BOJ was not aided by any other central banks. That is absolutely the case now. So the BOJ won has very little credibility because they've tried this many times and it hasn't worked. Let us take a look. This is the Nikkei. Let's minimize this and take a look at the dollar yen. Here we have the dollar yen on a monthly basis. Let me see if I can get my euro yen chart up. That's a bit more dramatic. These charts are all from Bloomberg. Okay, one second. This mouse is not quite as one might wish. Okay, so this is the euro yen. Where does this go when I minimize it? Well, it goes down here. Okay, cool. And this is the dollar yen. Okay, we just put the dollar yen up. Here's a monthly on the yen. Okay. Kind of an interesting point, interesting chart. Anyway, so the BOJ, back to the BOJ. The BOJ needs 1, cooperation, 2, credibility. It has neither. Now, it has some credibility because the market has taken the yen down here, right? I know this is a monthly chart. Almost 17% lower because of Japanese comments, because of Abe's campaign, because of Abe's election, because of what he said he would do. The Japanese also haven't done anything. Haven't intervened in the markets. Haven't lowered interest rates. Of course, they can't. So there is some credibility, but I think probably not enough. The Japanese are actually going to have to regain market credibility by acting. The ECB didn't really have to do that at this stage. Credibility, of course, is psychology. So that I think that in order for the BOJ to get the yen at 100 and the euro yen at, say, 125 maybe. Let's take a look at the euro yen. The euro yen's right here. So to get the euro yen up to 125 or 130, they're actually going to have to act. But what are they going to do? Can they sell enough yen to drive it down? Can they sell enough euro yen to drive it down? That's very questionable in my mind. Because you have to think how do they do this? They're not going to get cooperation from other central banks. Right now, everybody would like to do the same thing. And what would that be? Have a weaker currency. Now, I don't think you're going to get the kind of exaggerated sort of financial apocalyptic writings that you get in the financial media. Well, in the less responsible parts of the financial media. Currency wars, that's silly. But they don't need to do that because they're not going to get any cooperation from the other central banks. Do you think the Europeans really want a much stronger euro versus the yen? Do you think the Americans do? No, of course they don't. So I think there's a limit to what the Japanese, a very severe limit to what the Japanese can act. And in fact, even to keep it where it is now, the Japanese are going to have to come in and do what the Swiss did in a much larger scale. Maybe they will go out, this has been spoken about, and buy foreign sovereign debt. Meaning, what will they do? They'll have to come in, say, to buy European debt, German debt denominated in euros. What do they have to do? Well, they'll give whoever owns. They need to buy the debt in euro. So what will they do? They'll go into the currency markets. They'll buy euro and they'll sell yen, and they'll use that euro to buy European sovereign debt. They could do that. They could do it with dollars. They could do it with the sterling yen. Of course, the question is, how annoyed are they going to get all of the other central banks and all of the other governments in the world when they do this? So, the issue for the Japanese is credibility, consistency, 3 C's, how about that? Credibility, consistency, and cooperation. They are strongest in credibility. And that's not very strong, but it's the strongest out of the 3. They are weak in consistency. Because the market remembers. I remember. There's only been one generation of FX traders. So it's all the same people are still involved. It's kind of fascinating. You know, you think about Wall Street, you can read books from the 30s, from different markets. Everybody's gone. Their grandchildren might still be here. But in the FX market, it's the same people. The FX market really didn't start trading until about 85, 83, something like that. So it's 30 years. Many of those men, mostly men, a few women, mostly men, who started out in the 80s are now in their 50s or their early 60s. Many of them are still involved in the markets. So it's the same people, like me. I sat on a trading desk in the heyday of the interbank market from 88 till about 2000. So it is the same people. So all of us remember the ineffectiveness of the Japanese interventions in the past and their lack of consistency. They'd come in, they wouldn't come in. And the market just took them to task on it. And the last is cooperation. When the dollar was devalued, I think that was the late 80s or early 90s. I didn't look up the date. I should have in the Plaza Accord. All of the world central banks, well, the big ones anyway, cooperated. And it was very effective. And there have been effective currency interventions. You know, it'd be very difficult to sit here and say that so far the Japanese intervention hasn't been successful. It is. The yen is up 17%, down 17%. The dollar yen is up 17, down. The dollar yen is up the same amount. Look at this, from 95 to 120. That's a successful intervention. All they did was talk. The question is, can it be sustained? And with the exaggerated movement in the yen in the past 5 or 6 years, the question is, can it be sustained? So those are the three problems with the Japanese: credibility, consistency, and cooperation. And they don't really have what they need in those areas. Now, so let's look at the dollar yen briefly. Now, this is a monthly chart of the dollar yen. I don't really like monthly charts, but in order to get the range that I wanted to show, the historical range, you unfortunately need to use monthly charts. I would much prefer to have a daily chart. But, so, at this point, in the early 80s, the yen was severely undervalued. This would be one of Abe's points. At 250 yen to the dollar, Toyotas are really cheap. Subarus are really cheap. I remember my father bought a Subaru, sometime in the early 70s. One of the first Subarus that were exported here. My father was a man who bought Oldsmobiles his whole life, which were big American cars, now no longer made. And he tried this one Japanese car. And this is when the Japanese cars were small and tinny and not particularly well made, and he didn't like the car and he never bought another one. But at 250 or 300 yen to the dollar, it was cheap. And my father did like that. So he bought the car, and then he lent it to me, and I cracked it up. But that's another story. So at this point, remember, this is the period where the Japanese economy starts to dominate, or at least dominate in the mind, the psychology of the West, certainly the United States. The Japanese are going to take over everything. Well, one of the reasons it was so successful was because of the rate. But this is a historical anomaly. Much like the U.S. position in the industrial world after the Second World War, which was a historical anomaly, meaning it was something that happened because of historical circumstances which were probably not going to be repeated. So as the yen rose, as it should with a successful economy, this period from 100 up to 150 is more or less, I guess, where it should be. At least it's the only real way we have of determining where currencies should be is basically where they are, which is kind of circuitous logic, or where they're kept as with the Chinese yuan or other managed currencies. So this very steep fall over just a few years is a recognition, that's a 100% fall, is a recognition of the strength of the Japanese economy at that time. Part of which, of course, had been fostered by the currency rate, but also because the Japanese had new plant and equipment. Much of the industrial economy in Japan was destroyed in the Second World War, so everything was new. They were rebuilding. They had a tremendous amount of internal demand, which they could count on as a profit center for their export endeavors, and they were motivated. They were basically rebuilding their country after the Second World War. The American Air Force leveled almost every city of any size in Japan in the latter part of the war. So they were rebuilding there. So there were a lot of things going on which gave the Japanese economy natural internal strength. By the way, if anybody has any questions, just ask. I will. Oh, sorry, I forgot to check. I'll be glad to answer if I can. I do want to try and get through all this. Okay, it doesn't look like any of these. The Italian and the Japanese have the same accent. I will say that this is the first time I ever saw anything like that. I used to speak Italian fairly well. I have studied Chinese. I have not studied Japanese, so I can't answer to that one. Good question. Let me ask you one question. The smaller SNB was successful. Well, two reasons for that. One is, as you say, it was simply smaller. The amount of speculative flows in the currencies were much smaller. Plus, the SNB took the risk of having the market challenge it. And so it knew that if you do that, you must follow through. It's like I was telling my wife this morning. The kids didn't want to get dressed for school. They're 4 years old. And she's saying to one of my girls, well, if you don't get dressed, you can stay home. That's not a threat that can be successfully carried out because there's nobody home for the 4-year-old to stay with. And if anyone thinks a 4-year-old doesn't know that, you're wrong. So the SNB, once they made the line, they defended it, and they defended it successfully. The problem with the BOJ is their past history is that they've been unsuccessful in what they say they're going to do. I do not know whether it was MacArthur who set the yen at 360 to the dollar or not. It certainly is something which fits MacArthur's personality, but I don't for a fact know that that's true or not. Okay, Mr. Christie said it, so I defer to him. I assume that he knows. Okay, so those are the problems with the BOJ plan, with the Abe plan. Credibility, consistency, and cooperation. They're very low on the first. They're, in the market judgment, non-existent in the second and the third. So in order for the BOJ to make this policy work and to regain, and the BOJ is not really cooperating because the BOJ is concerned not really about inflation. Take a look at Japanese prices. I find this fascinating, actually. Okay, where's CPI? 30-year CPI. This right here, it doesn't show up on this chart. Let me get the other one. See if it shows up on this one. Yes, this is the zero line. This entire period is deflationary. Look at this. This is phenomenal. This is the thing which Ben Bernanke has nightmares about. Deflationary expectations, and this is now, say that's 95, that's probably about 98. So from 98 to 2012, that's 14 years of deflationary pricing in an industrial modern economy. No one's ever seen that. Deflation, much as inflation builds in an expectation loop, so does deflation. only in the opposite direction. If you expect prices to fall, you might defer purchases. If you defer purchases, then you defer production. And if you defer production by firms, they don't need as many people, and you have a cycle running in the wrong direction. This is what scares Mr. Bernanke. But the reason the BOJ is resisting the policies that Abe wants to put in are not because they're so, I don't think anyway, because they're so afraid of inflation. Now, one factor I want to deal with right at the end here, but I'll just mention it now. And this is why I want to go to Japan. The Japanese have a declining population. Not a threat for the future now. For about 3 or 4 years, Japanese population has actually declined. Not much, absolutely, yet, but population works on factors. So the longer a population goes with a low birth rate, the decline over the generations accelerates. If you have 50 people having one child, and everybody starts to die off, and you need 2, the next generation you have half as many people to have children. So the decline accelerates. It is my view, and I've said this many times in webinars, that this entire period here is part of the reason is the lack of dynamism in the Japanese population. Older people, behave differently than younger people, or at least they should. They buy less, they go out less, they don't consume as much, and they tend to save more. My parents, as they aged, spent less and less out in the world. Not only less time out in the world, but less money. In a modern consumer society, which we all live in, the assumptions, and you can look at social policy anywhere in the world, but particularly in the United States, where it is on display, because we're arguing about it all the time. It is predicated on an ever-increasing population. When Social Security started, I don't know exactly what the numbers are, but there were something like, say, 100 workers supporting 20 retirees. There's now something like 40 supporting the same 20. So the problem, if your population growth rate changes, you have social issues and you have consumption issues. So this is not only because of unsuccessful fiscal policies, of an overvalued yen. This is a lack of demand. You know, one of the things the New York Times columnist Paul Krugman has been, who is essentially, in my opinion, a polemicist and not an economist, although he, of course, is an economist. But his point from the very beginning of the financial crisis is that what you're going to get is a lack of demand. And he's right about that. His solution, of course, is endless and permanent government spending, which I think is not the correct solution and one which will not work anyway, because the government, especially one running a deficit as large as ours, cannot permanently support consumption, especially if there are demographic changes going on. Okay, so this is deflation. So the last point is the reason the BOJ doesn't want to do this is because Japanese debt, where do we have that? Debt to GDP. Percentage of Japanese debt to GDP. Now ours in the United States is now around 70%. It's headed towards 90%. There are many, I personally don't think that the administration will do anything to change that unless it's forced to, which means you'll have 8 years of trillion-dollar deficits. That will bring the U.S. debt level up to 90%, where there are a number of studies that say that this is where it starts to exert a profound drag on the economy. on production, on crowding out consumption, on crowding out investment. Well, look at the Japanese economy. I could only find on Bloomberg a chart for 10 years, but you get the idea. This number, although I cropped it badly, is 205%. That means Japanese government debt is more than twice the size of the economy and rising. You hear many arguments that this doesn't matter because it's all held internally. That is complete and utter nonsense. Complete nonsense. One of the things that's going on with deflation and with the Japanese GDP is that productive investment is being crowded out by Japanese debt. There's only so much money in an economy. And if there's deflation, there's even more pressure. We can look at the Japanese money supply. This is from the Organization for Economic Community and Development. This goes back to the 80s. That's money supply. What's interesting here is the slope. Even in this period here, the money supply did not rise dramatically. Take a look at the U.S. M2. This is U.S. M2. Okay, look at this in late 2008. Come on, mouse. This area right here went from here to here. Dramatic increase in the rate of the growth of the money supply deliberately by the Fed. And look at this here. Here we go. These are all the massive QE programs. Look at that. So whatever you want to say about the Fed and whether their policy is successful or not, it is doing what it said it would do. Again, this goes to credibility of the central bank. The Fed embarked on a loose money policy in 2007, and it has been consistent in the application of that policy since then. It has doubled, tripled its balance sheet. It's up in the trillions, but it hasn't changed its mind. It hasn't changed its analysis, and it's basically doubled and tripled down on its original policy. It has the virtue of consistency. It doesn't really have the virtue of success, but it has the virtue of consistency. The Japanese, that's a good question. The Fed stopped publishing M3 about 10 years ago. Their reason was that it no longer gave an accurate reflection of the money supply because of the facilitation enabled by electronic banking. I mean, now, we all fling our money around the world with computer strokes. At the time, people thought that the reason they stopped was because it gave the markets too much insight into Fed policy. In other words, the Fed may not have, if the Fed thought that the economy was overheating, it could reduce the money supply without making an announcement, and that would translate into signals and intelligence for the financial community. I'm not really sure why they did. I mean, what they said was that it no longer accurately reflected the money supply in the country. Many other countries still use M3. I could find an M3 for Japan. The reason I didn't, and these are the composition of what they're measuring. And honestly, I forget. I studied it in grad school. One of them includes checking, and one includes it is different types of money that's included in the measurement. The reason I used M2 is because for Japan is because I could compare it to M2 in the United States. Okay, so the issue for the BOJ, here are BOJ assets. Again, it's not the absolute dollars I'm looking at, but the slope of the line from 2008 up. In the United States, recently, the Fed, no one should ever forget this, the Fed has been buying, this is Japanese budget deficit of percentage of GDP. I'll talk to that in a minute too. The Fed has been buying 70%, and I say this every webinar, no matter what the topic, because I think it's probably the most important financial fact out there in the world right now. the Fed has been buying 70% of government debt issues. And that is exactly equivalent to you owing $10,000 on your credit card and writing a letter to the credit card company and saying, here, this letter represents $7,000. I give it to you. I now owe you $3,000. It's good as long as the credit card company accepts it. The Fed buying 70% of U.S. Treasury issues, 70% funding the federal deficit by ostensibly creating money. Of course, it doesn't really create money. What it does is it sends the money out into the financial system where it sits unused, basically. I mean, what happens? The Fed buys the money, it gives an IOU, it gives cash or whatever, electronic stuff to the government, and the government uses it to pay for things. So in fact, let me restate, it does create money out in the world. What the Fed does with some of its QE programs is a little different. Because if you're buying QE, if you're going out and buying mortgage-backed paper or whatever the assets the Fed is buying, those are owned primarily by large financial institutions. So when the Fed buys, it gives those institutions cash, electronic transfers, which they may or may not use and lend. If they lend it, then it creates money. It creates cash out in the economy. If they put it on deposit at the Fed, it does not. And by and large, that's what's happening. And it's not only that the banks prefer to sit on it, but there's not enough demand because the economy's not growing quickly. It's not growing really at all. Well, it's growing a little bit, but not very much. Okay, so the second policy of the Japanese government. Okay, so this is the percent. Oh, one last topic. So the reason the BOJ is wary of creating all this money is because there is all of this debt in Japan. Twice the size of the economy and the third largest economy in the world. And if we'll put it this way. If the BOJ is successful in driving inflation up to 2%, Japanese government debt pays zip. And it's paid zip, well, almost zip, for a long time, for 15 years. I should have gotten a chart with the return on JGBs, that's Japanese government bonds, on Japanese 10-year. It looks something like this. Okay, where is this chart? Trade balance, debt overnight. Here we go. The overnight call rate. Does this thing look familiar? Anyway, this pertains to the topic I'm moving to. So JGBs have been paying nothing for 15 years. If Japan Japan has had deflation for 15 years, so it's of less importance because prices are dropping. So if you're only getting a tiny amount, in 5 years you're going to pay less. So you add the deflationary effect to the interest rate that you're getting. That's why people would be willing to accept such low rates. Well, if you go from deflation to inflation, if you go to 2% inflation, then prices are rising. A 0.1% JGB is not terribly attractive in a rising market. And what happens to the bond market? The bond market starts to tank. It goes down because prices have to go down. We all know that the bonds trade opposite the rate. So rates go up, the prices go down. That's because the coupon on all bonds are fixed. So in order to make it a market rate, you vary the price. So if Japan gets inflation, what happens to the enormous existing stock of JGBs that are owned by everybody in Japan? The idea that just because it's owned domestically means that it's safe is nonsense. If you get 2% inflation, who owns all those bonds? Are they not perhaps going to sell them? Are they not going to drive down the prices and drive up rates? So this is the BOJ's concern. In addition, they also have concern about what the other industrial countries, who of course all want to reduce their currency. Everybody can't do the same thing at the same time. So those are the problems with BOJ. That's why they've resisted this policy for a long time. Second problem in Japan, the economy. Abe wants sustained. What word should I use? Sustained, enormous fiscal stimulus to spur the Japanese economy to greater growth. Aside from the population issue, which I've already discussed, is this policy likely to be effective? Again, this is where the credibility problem of the Japanese government is profound. Much as the BOJ tried to manipulate unsuccessfully, by and large, yen rates by itself in the 90s and also a bit in the 2000s, and was unsuccessful, so the Japanese government has been issuing supplementary budgets for 15 years, more actually, close to 20 years. And it hasn't worked. If you want a chart, and aside from the deflation chart, which probably gives Ben Bernanke worries, nightmares, this chart should also give him worries. This is permanent zero interest rate policy. Permanent. Has it done the Japanese economy any good? The answer is no, it hasn't. There's no sustained growth in Japan. Warning for the Fed. Now, in general, the U.S. economy is more dynamic than the Japanese. Warning to the White House on that. I was just talking to someone, our legal counsel here, and he was telling me that, I don't know if this is official yet, but he's heard talk that the CFTC and the NFA is going to prohibit credit card and PayPal funding of FX trading accounts in the United States. Again, regulations and other things do dampen the animal spirits of an economy. So, if the Fed thinks, and the Fed does not think, but if a government thinks that simply having low interest rates and flooding the economy with money will provide you with economic growth, this is the chart you look at. It doesn't work. It's not the reason that economies don't grow. So, the policy tools that the BOJ and the Japanese government, Abe's government, want to use are unremarkable. If they do what they say they will do, the only remarkable aspect they could have, and this is the Fed's analysis as well, what the Fed has done with low interest rates and flooding and trying to flood the economy with money isn't new from a theoretical point of view. What is new is the degree and longevity of the programs. That is new. The Fed with a close to $3 trillion balance sheet is a new aspect. It's so new in its degree that you could in effect say it's a new policy, but in fact it's not. The idea of it is not a new idea. And that's true in Japan as well. So the only way the Japanese could actually, I think, have an effect is to do far more and for far longer than they've ever done before. Come on, mouse. The problem with that is this. It's a different chart. Government debt as a percentage of GDP. The only one I could find had Italy on it as well. Over 200%. So if you do that, what will the effect be? If they are successful, bringing on 2% inflation, what will that do? From Abe's point of view, of course, what you've been doing for the past 15 years hasn't worked anyway. Is the risk worth it? It is. Okay, let me look at a few questions here, and then I'll wrap up. I know we're getting towards the end here. So far, we're in pretty good shape as for what I wanted to cover. There's a little bit more. Yes, a lot of the spending in Japan were endless amounts of infrastructure, but Japan doesn't really need any more infrastructure. They've got a declining population. They've got roads everywhere, and they're still building more roads and bridges and roads and all this stuff. It's not a productive investment. The only one who actually do productive investments well are the private sector. If you need new roads, this is the difference between a developing economy and a mature economy. You have in a developing economy like China, like India, like Brazil, like many other places, a tremendous amount of internal demand that does increase productivity, which ends up increasing wealth. In a mature economy like Japan, that isn't nearly as beneficial for productivity in the economy. In a place like the United States, they're probably somewhere in between. But by and large, infrastructure spending is a lot less conducive to increasing productivity. And increasing productivity is what produces wealth, makes the country and everyone else wealthier. How will countries pay their debts in the future? It is my opinion that sooner or later, governments, we've spoken about this a number of times in webinars, there are two ways to get rid of debt. You default or you inflate it away. Both methods have been tried. It's my opinion that you will end up with governments surreptitiously sponsoring inflation. And this is not just my opinion alone. You can look at the price of gold over the past couple of years, and that's exactly what it is. In my opinion, what would be the right cure for Japan's illness? That's a very good question. It goes to culture. There's that phrase from Arnold Toynbee, I think he's a British historian. Cultures and countries aren't destroyed, they commit suicide. It's tough to know what to make culturally of a country and the people of a country that refuse to reproduce or don't reproduce. I mean, Japanese birth rates are maybe 1.1, 1.2. That's well below replacement value, which is 2.1. So what does that mean for a culture's view of itself? Now, you have to be careful of going too far with this because a reduction in birth rates is a common, across all cultures, a common effect of increasing wealth. And this is true across all cultures. So it's not just the Japanese, or it's not just the Finns or the Germans. It's true for everybody. That as the economy gains wealth, people have fewer children. So there's that fact. Is there something else going on in Japan? I don't really know. I mean, I don't speak Japanese. A very good friend of mine lives there and does speak Japanese, and every time I see him, we talk about it. I don't really know. The world has never seen an event like this. If you're looking for a cure, the problem in Japan, or at least as it can be addressed by the government, if you want economic growth, it cannot be provided long-term by the government. It can't. First of all, you got to run up debt, but the government doesn't create growth. it can create the conditions for growth. It can also create the conditions for no growth or for very little growth. So address what you can to permit, and there are, Japan has a first-class world economy. It's kind of the last time they came up with an inventive product I can remember anyway. I think it was the Walkman in the mid-'80s. At the time, no one had ever seen a product like that before. I remember listening to it the first time. Wow, it's really good. So, but by and large, Japan has not been in the forefront of creating new products. If they want, so anyway, the things that I think the Japanese government could do would be to do as much as they can to withdraw regulation, fixed protected markets, all of the things that will permit companies and entrepreneurs to create companies, to create products, to create wealth. That would be my suggestion. As far as Japan's culture being corrupted by the West, I'm not really sure what that means. I do not think that's the problem. The idea of one culture being corrupted by another is not one that I hold to. Certainly Japan's history is a bit unique in the world, at least in the modern world. The Japanese, in the face of early Dutch and Portuguese merchants and traders and soldiers in Asia in the 1600s, closed off their country. They essentially revived. There were guns and cannons in Japan used by some of the warlords and others to fight each other. And the government, I don't think it was the government, I think that it was the warlords, what they did was they returned to a edged weapon samurai culture. And listen, this is not intended, nor do I want it to be an analysis of Japanese culture. It's not that they take too long holidays. I don't hold with much cultural analysis. On the other hand, cultures do account for a lot of difference. Anyway, so the Japanese history is a bit unique. They closed themselves off from the West, or from the world basically, for 200 years, successfully. The only country that they banned guns. And then they reopened their country in the 1850s with Commodore Perry. And by 1900, they had fought a successful war with the Chinese, where they the declining Qing Empire, where they took Korea. And they fought a successful war against the Russians in 1905. And then they continued their war with China in the 30s, ending in the Second World War. So it's an unusual history. And what this means for Japan's view of itself and its own culture, I don't really know. And so I will not speculate on that. Well, I thank you all very much. I actually covered most of what I wanted to cover, for which I thank everyone for listening. I hope that it was useful. This month, I just want to say one thing. Earlier this month, we did with FX Street, we did a customer's choice webinar. I put up 4 topics, or was it 5? 4 topics. And by vote on the FX Street website, people chose a topic, and that's the one that we did. I'm considering doing that again. So if you think that's a good idea, please let FX Street know, and we can run it again. Other than that, I will see you next month for at least one webinar and perhaps 2. Again, I hope this was useful. I thank everyone for coming. I will put my email up there. If you have any questions, comments, considerations, or anything else, please let me know, and I will do my best to answer. Again, thank you very much, and thank you, FX Street, for hosting these things. Everybody take care.